I want to share how Desmos allowed students to have a creative, authentic final for their integrated 2 experience. So I had the question, how do I create authentic assessment in a fully virtual environment? And my first thought was to have students create questions for the final assessment and then take each other's finals. So how would they present their questions? How would they interact with other student questions? What place could I use to gather them all? And how would they give feedback to each other? And so thinking about this, I thought, what about Desmos? We use Desmos a lot in our Integrated 2 course, and students are familiar with it. And what if they could use Desmos for that as well? So what if they could create an activity builder? So I drafted a plan and I brought it to my students during our problem solving session and asked them what they thought about it. And they seemed pretty excited to engage in something a little bit different. So I gave them this Desmos activity final project and I let them know we can change it. So I just want to take a look at it. And you're going to create a final test on Desmos. So they're going to use the activity builder on teacher.desmos.com. And you'll get teacher and peer feedback before you finalize it. You'll have a rough draft. And then I gave them some resources on how to create Desmos activities. I gave them a short 5 to 10 minutes actually on how to work it and how to make different screens. And then we talked a little bit about the grading breakdown. I gave them a list of concepts that came from each of the chapters, the big ideas, and then gave them some smaller bullets to give them some ideas and encouraged them to combine topics. So this is kind of what it looked like. Each chapter had 1 or 2 big ideas and then some ideas for bullet points for them to use in their activity builder. And I encouraged them to connect the concepts between the chapters. And then I gave them the grading and asked for any feedback. So I probably would change this a little bit next year, the giving feedback to students who completed your activity. I would probably lower that percentage and pull it back up into the Desmos activity, into the process, since it seems like students learned a whole lot more in that process than they did actually giving feedback to other students. So I also started a Canvas discussion. We use Canvas as our learning management and could be used anywhere, but this discussion was where they could talk back and forth and share ideas on how they were creating their Desmos activities. So I mostly stayed out of it, but they went back and forth. They even started talking about some of the computation layer, which took me years to get to, but they were already starting to use it. Each student added me as a collaborator on their activity builder final. So I was also a collaborator so I could make sure they were making progress and see what their activity was looking like. After they had their draft, so they submitted their draft, they gave each other peer feedback. So they did some peer review on the activities. So I created some guidelines, pretty simple guidelines on just whether they included the main ideas and then the overall understanding. So they had to reference the slide, whether it was included or not, and then some comments. And I asked them to please give actionable feedback to help improve the activity builder that was created. And most of them did a pretty good job. They also gave some feedback on the level of questions, whether they required thinking and explanation, resources used, the teacher guide, the teacher tips, and if it was easy to follow and engaging. So overall, they did a really great job giving each other actionable feedback. And they did this for 3 students. So they gave feedback to 3 students, and that means they received feedback from 3 different students. Of course, there were some that just gave little bits of feedback, so the good problem or involves factoring, but it was likely they got great feedback from at least one person. So after they finalized it, so I gave them feedback after they finalized it, and then they published it and made a student link. And they were randomly assigned 2 students' activities to complete, and they were able to choose the 3rd student. So they got to choose one, and then I assigned them to others randomly to complete each other's finals. So some examples of the finals, I like how a lot of them had welcome screens. So you can see their welcome screens. And some really good problems where they made images in Google Drawing and all kinds of places. A lot of them are asking for explaining the process. even started adding tables, used our local areas in the problems, which I thought was fun. They gave really great teacher tips, so they went through there. They added graphs, even card sorts in some of them. Some of them even came up with themes. So we had an escape room theme and like a Disneyland theme where all of the problems had to do with Disneyland, and even used some of that CL. So you can see that in this activity. I like that this one student sent students out somewhere else if they wanted to learn more about this, and thanked them for stopping by and hope they had fun on their final. Then they assessed each other's answers. So they looked at the responses to their activity, and then they gave feedback both through the Desmos feedback feature and through this Google form. So this Google form gathered everything, so it was in a nice spreadsheet for me to see how students were creating them and grading them. So these are some of the results and the reflection of the process. And I've really wanted to make sure that students were learning the topics of Integrated 2. And that this was an effective way to do that instead of studying for a final and making sure they knew everything. Did the Desmos activity do that? And by and large, they said that this was the most effective. And then they had to say why. So they had a couple of quotes. We had to make a test. You need a high level of understanding to make the test. For this one, it was a bit harder. That's why it was effective. And then another thing I wanted to know was, were they just creating their activity with things they already knew how to do and it didn't push their thinking? So I asked this question for that, and I got several yeses that it really helped them learn something they didn't understand before. And then how effective was the feedback you received? And then how much did you learn compared to a traditional final? How much did you enjoy this? I liked this a lot. But this is my favorite. So what were some things you liked about this final? And we try so hard in our math classes to make it interactive and creative. And to see this in a final assessment made me really happy and want to use this again. So that creativity showed up again and again in this response. And then the interactive and engagement and less stress showed up as well. Some things that you didn't like about the activity final or that we should change. So that's feedback for me for later. And I learned a lot from that as well. My overall reflections, I need to give examples of feedback so that they know what good feedback looks like and what not so great feedback looks like. Subgroups, I'm thinking about putting the students into subgroups. So small groups where they give feedback to each other on their activities. So it's more of a continual feedback loop. And then they take other subgroups activities, tests at the end. Have students write a description of their final if I'm letting them choose again, so that they know what kind of final they're choosing. They didn't really know. They would just click on somebody because they knew the person. So maybe even like a Flipgrid advertisement for their final. So we just want to say thanks to Desmos for everything. It's been such a key to our virtual learning, not only just for everyday activities, but to create a final where students were actively thinking and being creative and innovative. It was just amazing. So very much thanks to Desmos for everything you do.